welcome. Eduard Wagner. I already introduced myself before. So now we are looking into the study results of the stakeholder perspective. And here we looked very specific on the data gathering effort and the relevance, so the value of the information. So it's likely a cost-benefit analysis of the information that are potentially be in the product passport. So here, just to give you a little frame around, I want to show you the approach because this is quite important to understand what is our databases, and I will show you who was surveyed, what was evaluated, and which information. And in the results, I just give you some examples because they're quite big. So I will show you some of the most relevant information that we found, the information that are subject to technical and structural barriers, and also information, the relevant information per stakeholder group. So on the approach, we basically have two sides. You see on the left the data provider. So somebody, of course, has to generate the data and put it in the product passport. And on the other side, somebody will use the data. And this is basically also our approach. We had two different surveys, one for the data provider to evaluate the data generation effort and the data user to evaluate the relevance. You see here we have responses from the electronic sector, 139, and quite a bit more from the textile sector, 135. And on the data user side, electronic sector 97 and the textile sector 180. So the textile sector really dominated from the data user side, even more as from the data provider side. If you look below, there is a little distribution of the stakeholders. So once you see all the stakeholder groups that we identified, and what is also interesting, this is the example from textiles. What is also interesting, you see we have major contributions, major responses in the bottom part. So that means a lot of brands, retailers, product manufacturers, and suppliers took part in the survey. But nonetheless, we have some responses from reuse, repair, distribution, and these are also major companies or associations which represent a large stakeholder group behind. So next, should come. What was evaluated? So the second part, so on the left side, I already mentioned, we have the data provider, and the data provider side was evaluated towards the data gathering effort. And for this, we asked three questions. So this is a combination of three questions. Is the information already available to you? Do you generate the information automatically, or do you need to manually gather the information with Excel and mails? Or, and the final question, do you own the data? So can you generate it yourself internally in your company, or do you need to gather it from other companies, so suppliers, for example? On the data user side, we were basically asking one central question for the data relevance. Does this information has an economic relevance to you? And we asked the same information to both sides. So now, which information was evaluated? We looked into the mandatory information because we wanted to see how are the mandatory information performing, right? So we asked specifically about the ESPR information, but also other legal acts like the information requirements from eco-design, and textile regulation. And you see here, electronic has a higher number of information requirements due to the history of eco-design and the requirements that are already there. The second part are the information identified in the JRC Priority Product Group study, and this also correlates to the Article 7 information requirements of the ESPR. You will see it in a bit. And we also identified other potentially relevant information in previous tasks where we also had a survey on the initiative, and they told us which information could be potentially relevant. In total, you see electronics, we have 73 information that we evaluated, and textiles around 60. Here, to give you a little flavor of the information categories, first I want to highlight here the information in purple and with a little star there. These are the information categories from the JRC Priority Product Group study. You probably know them, and they're also more or less included in the ESPR. And the other ones are the information categories that we use. You also saw some from the battery pass project. They use slightly different categories, but this is the system that we use. Also, to give you a little flavor, which information are behind these categories. Here you see some examples. So on the material information category, you have, for example, information such as the name of the substance, the location, the concentration of the substance, or also information according to rows. Here, product design and service, information how to install, use, information on disassembly, and here you see also these are all coming from the ESPR or other legislations, but we also included some more information. The bottom is quite interesting. Here you see product and energy resource efficiency. These are information relevant for calculating the LCA. And here you have material energy consumption and also GHG emissions. The full list is also available then in the report. And here just a little insight. So let's look into the results. It is quite complex. You need to dive a bit in. You see here on the y-axis is the relevance. At the top, you have a very high relevance of information. And here we categorize information categories first. And on the x-axis, you have the data gathering effort. So on the very right, you have a very high data gathering effort. So now if we look a bit into the different sections, I want to highlight here first the very high relevant information at the top. These are rated quite high, but still have an overall low data gathering effort. And if you look, the product identification, yeah, it makes sense. It is quite necessary and demanded product design and service information and functional technical specification. They also don't require too much data generation effort because they are already somewhere mandatory or voluntary generated. So here we would suggest the adoption of these information categories is quite doable and rather simple to generate. So the next is information categories that are of medium relevance but require very high data generation effort. And if you see, if you look into the information categories, recycled content, material information, sustainable sourcing, also you see here these information are related to suppliers, for example, need to be gathered externally and also require some work to generate. These are not straightforward, for example, the recycled content. The last section I found very interesting is the generation of waste, which was seen of very low relevance. I assume there has to be some communication done why this is relevant. So we also have found some categories where we think here the use case should be demonstrated and why this information is necessary. Let's look a bit into the details. So you saw the categories, and here are, for each of these categories, the top 25 relevant information. You see the information in the middle in detail. And on the very right side, you see now a bar. The length of the bar indicates the benefit. So a high bar indicates a high benefit. And the color indicates the data generation effort. So a green bar means low generation effort. A red bar, high generation effort. So now looking again into what is interesting. So first, the product identification is again one of the most relevant information categories and does not require too much generation effort. So I think this is quite, adoptable. The material information is relevant, and if you see, the most relevant are also already required by law. So this could be also seen as already there, which could be implemented. The last section is the durability and repairability is also amongst the top 25 relevant information, but you see the data generation effort here is quite high. What I also found interesting here is these two bars. These are very red, so I was looking into what made them effortful for generating this information, and you see here this extended repair information, which includes this assembly instruction, component map, and the wiring diagram. These information all need to be gathered manually, 100% in the electronic sector. The same applies to recycled content. We have a high manual data gathering effort, and this is what impacts this data generation effort. I also want to show you some of the textile categories and what was maybe interesting. So the material information here you see also amongst the top 25 relevant information, but mostly also not too hard to gather. And if you look more closely into the single information, you see most of these are substances of concern or substances of a particular compliance list. So I assume, or we assume, these are already more or less generated somewhere. Except for the detailed chemical content, this is one of the hardest information to gather. Also makes sense, right? Very specific detailed chemical content requires a lot of data from the suppliers. Here also what I want to highlight, you saw in the electronic sector that was more durability, reliability. Here the textile sector suffers more from the recyclability and recycled content. So the generation of the recyclability information and recycled content information will be a challenge. Here, I also just want to highlight, you will find all the results in detail in the report, but what I found here interesting, these are the top 5 information and information categories that are subject to structural and technical barriers. Structural barrier means the data has to be acquired from external partners, from suppliers. And technical barrier means the data has to be generated manually. And you see here in the textile sector, the highest barriers is the structural barrier. Here for especially product and energy resource efficiency, that means the information that are necessary for calculating the LCA. Also, if you think of the value chain of textiles, this is quite long, and generating this information then makes also sense that this is quite complex. In the electronic sector, we see the counterpart here. We have more or a higher technical barrier for the information, in particular material information, but also, again, as mentioned, recycled content. Finally, we were also interested which information are actually relevant for which stakeholder group. And here you see electronic and textiles. You can read a bit through. What I want to highlight here is information that are relevant not only for one stakeholder, but for several stakeholders, and which are not yet mandatory. That means here for the distribution and retail, product images are quite useful, that are also useful for repair and reuse. So we have requirements coming from several stakeholder groups, not yet mandatory, so this could be an idea to consider it if this can be included as an optional field or even a mandatory information when, for example, developing the delegated acts. Individual specification of product functions that were discussed quite intensively, only mandatory information or also other information that are potentially relevant, and the repair date. You see also with the highest effort, there are not too many that require a lot of effort, but the repair date is amongst them. And for textiles, again, product images would be very useful. Also, product images are quite large, I guess, and can blow up the DPP. But yeah, this is the next step to evaluate if they should be present there. Retail information and unique product identifier is already mandatory. So here really just to give you a flavor of how the report looks like and which information you can draw from it. That's it.